So the ways we gather data, these are the different ways that I can pull data together. A sample survey is one that we're most familiar with, and many of you for your projects will actually be doing sample surveys. It's a study that asks a question, and it's always drawn from some population, rarely the entire population, in hopes of learning something about their entire group. Sample surveys are done for voting to gather the general disposition of a country or of a group of people. Where are we leaning towards? Samples are done for, okay, which brand do you like better, Coke or Pepsi? That's a sample survey. A census is when you get to go all crazy on a sample survey, but where you get the entire population. The problem here is a census, if you miss even one person, it's no longer a census. Now, census are very, very difficult to do because it's so hard to gather the entire population, especially if it's a large population. And because of that, they're not done very often. In the United States, we do a census every 10 years, and that is legally controlled. You are obligated to participate in it if you are a certain age, and it is extremely expensive for the country to do. Now, because censuses are so difficult to get everybody, we do different types of samples to try to force our sample to reflect the population. And these two right here, a stratified random sample and a cluster sample, are oftentimes confused for each other. Think about it as a layer cake. For your birthday, you've requested a layer cake. You want one layer to be chocolate, one layer to be vanilla, one layer to be chocolate chip ice cream, and a layer of brownie, just for giggles. A stratified random sample is a way in which each subdivision or subpopulation or strata, or in the example of a cake, each layer of your cake is included in your sample. For example, if I were to take a slice of cake, it would force each layer to be selected in equal proportions to the whole. So that if my chocolate layer was a ½ inch thick, my vanilla layer was 1 inch thick, my chocolate chip ice cream layer was 3/4 of an inch thick, and my brownie layer was 1 inch thick, that's a really big cake, all of the resulting slices would follow those same proportions. So we have subpopulations, or strata. Random samples are drawn from each particular stratum to make sure that you maintain those populations. If the strata are homogeneous, but are different from each other, a stratified sample may yield more consistent results. Homogeneous means that they are layered out. For example, a homogeneous mixing of oil and vinegar or oil and water, you will actually see the specific layers. Doing a stratified random sample is oftentimes nice because it forces you to have an accurate distribution of your smaller groups, and therefore the results may be more consistent than a regular simple random sample. Because remember, in a simple random sample, you are just as likely to get a sample of size n that contains only one group as you are to get a sample of size n that contains equal proportions. Stratified random sample is taking a slice of your cake. A cluster sample is your 2-year-old niece or nephew who reaches out and grabs a fistful of cake and only gets one layer. Like, I want the brownie. So I'm going to grab a fistful of this cake and I'm just going to get this one brownie. A cluster sample is when we have different groups and maybe I only pick one group, or maybe 2 groups. A cluster sample is where, for some reason or the other, not every single group is accounted for. Cluster samples are also commonly done when it comes to geographical location. Sometimes it's easier to grab a cluster of people from one neighborhood, or to grab a cluster of people from one state. Whereas a stratified random sample would need one street from every neighborhood, or two streets, or however many houses it would take to have an equal distribution. A cluster sample is good when you are talking about a heterogeneous mix, when things are all mixed together. Okay? Something that would be heterogeneous if we're going for our food description. For example, I don't know, your chocolate chip ice cream. That's heterogeneous. Everything is mixed in. Whereas Neapolitan is done in slices of flavors. So, thinking about cake, stratified is when you take a slice out of the cake. Cluster is when you take a fistful out of the cake. You might not grab all of your strata. A cluster sample is okay, though, if you're talking about a heterogeneous mixture, where every single area has an equal distribution. Sometimes, however, we need to combine some of these steps, and when we do that, we have a multi-stage sample. For example, we might have a stratified random sample where we make sure that we get equal proportions to the population of males and females, of 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders. But I'm going to do a cluster sample, and I'm only going to ask, or I'm only going to sample folks who are on the first floor of the building. So that way I can force that I get an easier sample collected, but I have a true representation of my population. Now, systematic. Guess what that means? It means you follow a system. I know, it's brain surgery. Who would have guessed? A systematic sample is any time that you have a system to sample from a frame. For example, wow, another typo! When there is no relationship between the order of the sampling frame and the variables of interest, this is okay. When it's just a completely randomized list. But if you're dealing with something, for example, if I were to take all of the phone numbers in the alphabet and only pick the first 100 names, that's a system. It's not a good system, but it's a system. That is a systematic sample. You could take the 20th name from each page. Maybe you take the first name on each of every 20 pages. Anytime that you can spell out, I did this to get it, and somebody could mimic the exact same steps and come up with the exact same sample, that's systematic. So now we're up to a convenience sample. Well, convenience sample is really just what's easy. It's a sample consisting of the individuals who are conveniently available, hence convenient sample. What that means is sometimes when we take samples for voting, we'll go to the cafeteria and we will grab the first 20 people that come in. It's not always a very good idea because it's not convenient to sample everybody equally. The first 20 people that come into the cafeteria might be the 20 people who are taking a GEMS class that happens to be located right next to the cafeteria. Or maybe it's a freshman English class, and so all you get are freshmen. Just because something is convenient doesn't mean it's good. But you can't always discount convenient samples either. They have their purpose, they have their place. Convenient samples are okay if you're not talking about a really important piece of information, you're just trying to gather a general idea. Each of these different things can work. You just have to be careful because you can be biased in any of these. A convenient sample might be biased because it doesn't reflect all the members of population equally. Same thing with a cluster sample. If you're looking at neighborhoods, well, one neighborhood might have a different socioeconomic status than another. You might have wealthier people in one neighborhood than another. So if you sample just the wealthy neighborhoods, you are going to have a biased response. And the idea behind a stratified sample, well, by forcing yourself to pick certain populations and certain percentages within each population, not everybody has an equal chance of being selected because you are dealing with each group separately. And that's what can go wrong. Bias is any systematic failure of a sampling method to represent its population. Anytime. Bias is the worst thing that you can do in statistics. It makes pretty much any of your statistics void. It nulls it out, it cancels it out, it's no longer something that you can believe or put any weight in. You cannot recover from bias. So we have to do everything that we can to prevent it. Some of the forms of bias is voluntary response bias. You got to be careful here because a lot of these sound very similar. Voluntary response bias is what happens when people choose for themselves whether or not they participate in the sample. So for example, when you go through the line at Panera, sometimes you will get at the bottom of your receipt, here, go to this website, take a survey, and enter to win a gift certificate. Well, typically the only people who participate in those are the folks that are either really, really happy, or really, really upset, or really, really desperate for a gift certificate. Same thing with if you're looking online and you want to plan a trip and you go to Travelocity. The folks that make comments typically are the folks that have really strong opinions one way or the other. They're the ones that are more likely to participate. And because of that, we have voluntary response bias. It doesn't adequately represent the entire population. And so from that, we cannot always recover. Now, for all of these forms of bias, they're not always avoidable, but you have to make sure you mention them because it does change things. And you have to tell folks, all right, it's like that saying, take it with a grain of salt. You know, it might not be exact. Undercoverage is also another issue. Basically what it has is it's when you, any type of sampling scheme or sampling mechanism, whether it's stratified, cluster, anything that you do, that for some reason one portion of the population has less representation than it is overall. So in my sample, some proportion of the population is underrepresented. That can happen in a simple random sample. It happens. You just have to be careful. That's why whenever we have a scheme in itself, we want to make sure that it avoids undercoverage as much as possible, which is why a lot of times we will stratify. Okay, now what's the difference between voluntary response and non-response? Non-response is, okay, I'm sitting down and I am giving all of my first period class voting for homecoming court. Every single person gets the survey. Every single person is required to respond, but some people just choose not to. The big thing with non-response is when you have a large fraction of those sampled who fail to respond. Okay? Sometimes voluntary response just means that the small proportion of the folks in the middle don't respond. Non-response happens when you have one large group or one large population that doesn't respond. For example, when you're doing the census, a lot of times you have groups that do not believe in government interaction or government interference, and so they will not participate in the census, and they will do whatever they can to avoid it. Well, that is a specific type of a group, so they are affected by non-response. Pardon me, I have to pause every time I cough. Okay, so response bias is a little bit different. Response bias is not, okay, you've got the responders versus the non-responders. Response bias is anything that might steer an answer one way or the other. For example, I can say, does anybody have any questions? And make it sound like having a question is a bad thing. And therefore fewer people will actually have questions. Or if I said, oh my goodness, anybody that has a question, I'm going to give you a bonus point if it's a good question. That's going to steer them towards a different way. I could say something like, well, you know, brunettes are so much smarter than blondes. So who do you think is better, blondes or brunettes? That's going to steer my response. That creates response bias. Sometimes response bias can be as simple as the order in which your choices are offered, the tone of voice that an individual uses, or the actual wording selected in the question. Okay? So our differences here. Bias is anything that steers your direction one way or another, either towards a certain group or towards a certain outcome. That can be based off of voluntary response bias because you have certain people who are more likely to respond on their own than others. Undercoverage is when you have a large population of a specific group who is not represented. Non-response is when you have a larger fraction in a group or one specific area that fails to respond. Voluntary response, you're choosing to respond, you're choosing to participate. Non-response is very similar, but it's when you have a large fraction that does not participate. And response bias is when we're steering an answer one direction or another. Okay, so we've seen a lot of vocabulary terms here. A lot of them are very, very similar, and you'll want to really examine the differences between them, especially our types of bias. In order to do that, reading the chapter is going to be your best piece of help. So please go through and do that. Make some notes on what the key differences are, especially between your forms of bias and between your forms of sampling, so that you're familiar with these terms. Because again, when we take quizzes and tests, it's oftentimes going to be just one word difference that makes it whether or not it's correct or not. Please come prepared to class with any questions that you may have. We will summarize what we've talked about here, but for the most part, today was just about vocabulary. I hope you have a great day. See you guys soon.